Hey everyone, let us join in our blessing over Torah as we prepare to dive into Parashat and more, this week's Torah portion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah Hafokba, lasok b'divrei Torah. Yadadai-dai-dai-dai-dai. 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 Yadadai-dai-dai-dai. Welcome to everyone who just joined us, everyone who is joining in through Facebook or YouTube. It's good to be able to study with all of you. So let me get on my screen. Okay, as we focus on this week's Torah portion, so it's Parashat and more. There is a whole lot of stuff in Parashat and more. And essentially, this week's Torah portion from the Musar Torah commentary focuses on a couple of very, very short snippets so that we can focus on the midah, the soul trait of Shvil HaZahav, which is moderation. So I want us just to start, if we're talking about moderation, starting with Maimonides feels like a pretty appropriate place to begin because he talks a lot about moderation as a whole. Does anyone want to read this text from Hilchet Deot? Any takers?
Which thing is it to read?
This top one right here. Can you see it?
The path of the upright is one of moderation in every trait, so that each trait is equidistant from either extreme and not close to either. Therefore, the early sages commanded that human beings should put their traits before themselves constantly and direct them to the middle road, so that each person will be complete.
Okay, so what do you make of this comment? Thank you so much for reading.
Well, I think that's I would say that's Maimonides' main theme throughout everything that he did was moderation.
It certainly is something that he comes back to many, many times, yes.
The golden path. It was so vital in all his writing. Avoid the extremes.
Well, so why is that so important to him?
That's a good question. You know, he lived in a strange environment that he lived in. He was in Egypt, he lived. So he's living in a different culture. And he saw the world enormous. He saw quite a bit of the world for the 12th century. And he could see all the different things that play. And he could see the extremes, and how that could cause problems. So he's constantly advising the people on both sides, moderation. The world was awash in diversity and excesses. And he was also a medical doctor, so it was natural for him to say that.
Thank you, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah,
Isn't it about equanimity? It's like with all of our character traits, we want to strive for a place of balance. And I think that's what he's talking about, is just not to go to any extreme with moderation. I mean, there are things about don't overindulge in alcohol, don't overindulge in sex, don't overindulge in giving as well. You know, because if you give too much, then you're not taking care of yourself. Mm-hmm. So right now I'm getting a pedicure. I just want you to know. It's fun right here. Anyway,
Good for
so
you. Self-care.
it's all about equanimity, about
Yes.
finding that balance. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, the extremes he talks about, hedonistic on one end and being too severe on the other end. And
Yeah, and so many of our soul traits, that's exactly what it does, as Bonnie said,
Yeah.
right? So what you're talking about are with like, you can be too severe, or you could be too, the word in Hebrew that's used is chesed. Too loving feels like the wrong word, because there should be a lot of love in the world. But within the different midot, and we remember, like during the Omer, and Bonnie teaches about this so beautifully, right? Each week we focus on a different soul trait during the period of the Omer, the period between Passover and Shavuot. And there's two soul traits very often that are side by side. One for which one of them is Din, and that's on the other side of Chesed. Din means to be judgmental and sometimes stirred, and that the part of ourselves actually compels us to do our very best. It's the part that says, nope, you could do a little bit better, and that pushes you to do your very best. But Chesed on the other side is you could be too accepting, so that it actually could be enabling or not helpful, or it holds you back from being your best self. And what do? We try to find the balance between all of those things. Yeah, Tom, please.
I was just going to say kind of along those lines, and kind of also what Bonnie was saying is, creation is the creation of good and evil. It's creation of everything. And in Musar, we learn there are two sides, that have to be balanced together. So too much of one side is not healthy and it's not good. So that's all kind of the overall focus, right? I think that's what I was just trying to hit.
Yeah, beautiful.
Rabbi Cassi?
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yes. Yeah, you're good. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just wondering, I don't know why this popped into my head. We're talking about middle of the road, but could this also apply to truth? When two people have disputes, I think actually a rabbi once told me, it was at Ner Tamid, that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So I don't know why that, but could that apply to that too? Not extreme one way or the other. And then you could be perhaps more tolerant of each other and more compromising.
So your question is a really, really good one. And it's a complicated one, more complicated than it seems on surface value, right? Because it's true, when two people have a story, very often the truth is in between them. However, sometimes when we say in between, we believe in a false dichotomy where it's right in the middle. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's not the case. This could be someone's opinion. This could be what someone else thinks. And the truth is actually right here, not right in the middle. So it's just kind of a reminder that, yes, we can learn from everyone, but what we learn might not necessarily be what, like, we can take learning from everything in all circumstances, but that doesn't mean that both sides are equally correct.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
We'll go into Emet as its own soul trait and kind of see how that factors in. I think we have an Emet unit that's coming up pretty soon that will get more to that question, because it is really complicated and it's super important, especially in this world that we live in today, right?
I was going to say on the extreme thing, and I know a little bit about that. When I become extreme in something, I'm not just trying to prove what I believe right. I'm trying to prove my enemy wrong when you become extreme. And so that's when we have, because once we become extreme in one way or the other side becomes an enemy, not a fellow citizen, not a fellow child of God. They become an enemy when you become extreme, when you start to, and that becomes you become very stubborn, because you don't ever want to hear anything bad about what you want to believe. You'll just start accepting that and not looking up. But a big point of like, you know, and there's usually an enemy on the other side of that, right? And that's why you're extreme for something. So I don't know. I just know that when it comes through extremism or being extreme in something, I'm usually full of fear, and that's why I'm being extreme. I'm want to go after something because I'm full of fear of it or something. So that's what I take from extreme.
Yeah, that's so important to bring in, that there's other factors at play. And if we're not aware of those factors, they can take hold in us in ways that aren't necessarily healthy. So yeah, thank you so much.
I think I can. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. It's okay.
One of the things that happens when people become perfect at something or perfect in an area, they become judgmental about people who are not perfect in that area. Well, I've been on a diet and I lost some weight. Now I'm critical of you because you can't do it. You know, it's something like that. So that's another way of balancing things. You become. I think when you're balanced, you never get there. I don't think I ever will. But if you ever get there, you become less judgmental about people who are struggling with whatever they're struggling with. Be balanced.
When we're secure in ourselves, we don't need to put someone else down.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's hard. That's really, 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 really hard. There are so many factors in play. I appreciate that. Yeah, Jim, please go ahead.
Actually, I might be able to add a little something to that. I was arguing one time with a fellow over a statement that exists in the New Testament somewhere about the meek shall inherit the earth. And to him, it sounded like this, you should be a doormat. You know, you should be entirely meek. Now, a little bit of research I did into the translation of the Bible in the King James era, I found out that the order was out to make it not offend the aristocracy in the English, and they purposely translated a Greek word that was in the writings as meek, but the original understanding of it was not somebody who was completely servile, but a person who could control their emotions, so they were not overly angry for trivial things, but on the other hand, they had a righteous anger when they saw some injustice being perpetrated. And in that connection, it makes the statement anything but a suggestion that you be a doormat. And it speaks to the middle ground in the area of your anger or your reaction to things. So I thought that was kind of insightful. It was a little bit of commentary I read on that really made it seem much more reasonable than just an admonition to take everything from everybody.
So Jim, I'm going to give you one little extra piece there, which is, you know, the expression turn the other cheek. It has a similar connotation the way that we use it today, right? Turn the other cheek, don't let it bother you, just kind of like go with it. That's not actually what it meant. Because if you turn your cheek to face the person who is trying to hit you, that person is forced to actually look in your eyes as they're doing it. It's saying, all right, I'm going to let you do this, but I want you to know what you're doing and to see me as a human being while you're doing it. And there's something really interesting about that too. It strikes me as somewhat similar to what you're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so being a doormat, that's not the way. Holding people accountable in a way that is actually, you know, with integrity and dignity as opposed to anger, that is.
Right, except of course that sometimes you may see something happening that a righteous anger is actually called for. Somebody beating a child, for example, or beating an animal.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why all of these things are so complicated, because it's not one steadfast rule. It's as it applies in a particular circumstance. So this is a great kind of entree conversation into Shvil HaZahav, into the importance of a middle road, because we see that there's so many places in which it comes up. The way in which Rabbi Mark Katz, who I was in seminary with, he's a really good guy. The way in which he's talking about it in this portion is through the holidays of Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Yom Kippur being a holiday of fasting, and Sukkot being a holiday of great joy and eating and celebration. And how these things can go to extremes if we let them, but how that's not actually the intent. So if we look at these texts a little bit, one, I threw in this one text from Ecclesiastes: don't overdo goodness and don't act the wise man to excess, or you may be dumbfounded. Don't go too far in either direction. It's not a good thing, right? Trying to hold yourself back. And Alan Marinis in Everyday Holiness, I included a number of pieces from the chapter on moderation in Everyday Holiness, because really I found it to be incredibly profound what he wrote. But he said things are healthy in moderation, but potentially damaging in either excess or abstention. Much research says that a moderate intake of alcohol can be good for your health, though we all know the sorts of diseases and problems born of alcoholism. The same is true for dieting, which can maintain a healthy weight and can also devolve into anorexia. At the other end of the scale, obesity is now a major public health issue. Self-esteem is necessary spiritual strength, while self-debasement or arrogance veer away from the balanced middle range. So it is with many other things we do in our lives, except for what is harmful in any measure, which ought to be totally avoided. In most other cases, the ideal route is the middle one, neither abstaining in the absolute or indulging to the hilt. And that essentially is what we're going to be focusing on. So in this portion, as I mentioned, Rabbi Katz points out the practices of fasting can lead us to asceticism, and the festive holidays filled with food and wine can lead us to hedonism if we're not careful. And so he brings up these two different sections that we're going to talk to. And the first one, in relation to Yom Kippur, is to deal with asceticism. So this is a passage from this week's Torah portion. Says, "Speak to the Israelite people thus. In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall observe complete rest, a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts." This is Yom Kippur. "You shall not work at your occupations. You shall bring an offering by fire to God. God spoke to Moses, saying, mark the 10th day of the 7th month as a day of atonement. It shall be a sacred occasion for you. You shall practice self-denial, and you shall bring an offering by fire to God. You shall not do any work that day, for it is a day of atonement on which expiation is made on your behalf before your God. Indeed, any person who does not practice self-denial throughout the day should be cut off from his kin. And whoever does work throughout that day, I will cause that person to perish from among his people. Do no work whatsoever. It is a law for all time throughout the ages in all your settlements. It shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for you, and you shall practice self-denial. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from the evening to evening, you shall observe this your Sabbath." And so we have this repetition that comes up of self-denial, 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 right? Are there any other questions or kind of other pieces that you gleaned from this text?
Well, the sentence that says, "I will cause that person to perish from among the people." Well, that's kind of extreme, isn't it? If they're not quite practicing the way God would want them to. Doesn't that seem extreme to you?
Through our modern eyes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
What we have to understand is at the time that it was written, what it meant. And essentially, these were the central practices of the people. So if you were someone who refused to take part in the central practices of the people, in essence, you were distancing yourself from the people. That's not the way we view it today. No one would ever be thrown out of the temple because they didn't observe Yom Kippur. Like, that's obviously not appropriate in any way, shape, or form. But this wasn't written today. This was written a long time ago. But you're right. Some of the wording here is very, very strong.
It was also pretty
yeah.
pretty extreme, if I'm remembering correctly. Didn't Aaron had two sons that were killed because they was it Aaron? You know, that didn't either follow directions or spoke inappropriately or did something out of
Right.
Yeah.
You're remembering the Aish Zerah. They offered strange fire, alien fire to God, and they were killed. And that definitely was an extreme case.
So I agree with Sari on that. And this extremes, but that's the way it was.
And so here we are in a Torah study that's all about moderation, and we're seeing extreme within our text, right? There's a lot of contradiction that takes place, and we're going to see a lot of that coming up too. Anyone else have any questions or thoughts here?
I was noticing that there's a couple things going on. On one hand, there's this call to abstain, to the extreme somewhat, but not really. You know, the other thing is, but you're not going to be working. You're going to be resting. So there is a balance there in the call to abstinence. It's also abstinence from working, from you know, putting energy out. So you're not being asked to do a lot of negative kind of don't do this, don't do that, but hey, take on rest. So take on that kind of thing that's going to help you to do the other. So that's what I thought.
That's good. I think that context does help quite a lot. Thank you.
It also means you're not earning or having other people earning.
Yeah, everyone is doing that rest. So there's something that everyone's in it together.
And we're talking about one day out of the year. So if you put it within that kind of a box, if you know it's going to be that one day, and we know it because we actually talk about it quite a bit. And we forget that later on, there are going to be, if you're ill, if you have a child, there are many exceptions to preserve life. But if we take it that way and we say, this is an opportunity to do this, we're talking about once a year, people. What can we do differently? How can we enlarge that? What might we want to be thinking about besides that we're hungry? You know, there is more than hunger to life, you know, and you prepare for it. You eat before, you eat after. So when you take it within what is the totality of your year, whether it is your Hebrew year or your, you know, United States year, it puts it a little bit differently. This is saying you'll be cut off from your kin. Well, for how long? And maybe some of your kin cut you off anyway. You know, I think that it is a day to contemplate, should you choose to use it that way? And this is urging you to use it that way. It doesn't say you're going to die.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of what you just said, Rabbi Catherine, is what's going to come in through these commentaries that we're about to look at. Because, I mean, that there is a balance. There is kind of this check in place to make sure we don't go to a place that is unhealthy, right? And if that is where we're going, okay, time to take a step back, right? And to see what exactly is going on. So in his commentary, Rabbi Mark Katz writes, over the course of time, self-denial, or in some translations, affliction, has come to mean 5 distinct categories of behavior we should avoid on Yom Kippur. We should not, 1, imbibe food or drink, 2, bathe, 3, anoint or wear perfumes, 4, wear leather shoes, or 5, have sexual relations. Because they're so ingrained in Jewish practice, refraining from these behaviors might seem like self-evident fulfillment of the biblical command. However, the Jewish tradition could have chosen any number of other activities that equally fulfill the mandate to afflict ourselves. For example, sleep deprivation, or ice baths, or self-flagellation. In fact, our rabbis even consider briefly the possibility of sitting for prolonged times in the sun or shade on Yom Kippur. However, what separates these options from the 5 adopted categories of afflictions is that the latter form a sort of middle ground. They serve the purpose set out by our Torah to practice self-denial while remaining firmly planted in the everyday events of our world. Practiced only for one day, just like you said, Rabbi Catherine, they do not go so far as to cross into the ascetic. So then as we read this and as we think about it, why, if asceticism is so bad, is it important to have a day that is focused on self-denial? Or maybe focused is too strong a word, a day that so deeply incorporates self-denial.
Is that in order to humble yourself to God and also to yourself to reflect?
When we change what we're doing, it
Mhm.
changes our mindsets too.
Right.
Yeah.
It's supposed to bring us closer to the spiritual realm when we forget about our bodies and leave our bodies behind. So I believe that that's why we're doing that.
Yeah, and in fact, the text we're going to get to in a second talks to exactly that, Sandy.
Well, and it's like you figure out that it's not so bad. I mean, to not eat for one day, it doesn't say don't drink water. It doesn't say torture yourself. It says don't do these things today. And I know a lot of times I get asked, well, aren't you afraid? Aren't you this? No, because it's one day. I know I prepared. You prepare in advance and you prepare in reflection as well.
Yeah, when you plan for it and you really think it through, it is a little bit different.
I wonder
Oh,
if
I must
could
have
ask
changed the order on this. Sorry. We will get to that text, Sandy, just not quite yet. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I just wonder about the one about not wearing shoes, and then in brackets it's with leather. What would you do if you weren't wearing that type of shoes? I mean, would you be barefoot, or would there be some alternative type of footwear?
Yeah, you'd wear something else. You'd wear cloth or
Mhm.
something that wasn't considered a luxury. So the idea is that we're not dressing in luxurious things. It's not about being in beautiful attire and appearance. It's about really just focusing not on the body, but on the soul. Whether that's always what happens in practice is another story, right? We all have different ways of observing holidays, and that changes over time, but that was its original idea there. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I'm going up and down. The Judah Halevi does actually speak a little bit to this idea of the angels. So he says, the fast of this day is such as brings one near to the angels, because it is spent in humility and contrition, standing, kneeling, praising, and singing. All his physical faculties are denied their natural requirements, being entirely abandoned to religious service, as if the animal element had disappeared. The fast of a pious man is such that eye, ear, and tongue share in it, that he regards nothing except that which brings him near to God. It's really beautifully written, isn't it? So Marquette's comments based on this text and based on this idea of this focus on the soul, and says here fasting is not merely a form of self-denial. Rather, the act of restraint is meant to elevate the one who fasts to unknown spiritual heights, to the level of angels. The rabbis feared that one who stands in the place of angels may never want to leave again. Thus, many medieval commentators advocate vigorously for the restrictions on Yom Kippur observances to one day in the diaspora, different from the rest of the holidays, which are celebrated for 2 days. They know that if left to our own devices, many would put their bodies in danger by reaching for the spiritual release that comes with starvation. As Moshe Isserles writes in his gloss to the Shulchan Aruch, there are those who are strict and seek to observe 2 days of Yom Kippur, but they shouldn't behave so stringently because of the fear that they might fall into danger. So do you believe that? Do you think that people would dive into 2 days, even if it put their own health or body in danger?
It's possible. It's possible, of course.
People always have the choice of going to the extremes in any way,
That's right.
whether it's under eating, overeating, drinking, whatever, you know.
Mhm.
I would like to know, at what age for children would you introduce these ideas? I mean, I know when I was a kid, I knew nothing about this. I knew Yom Kippur, we fasted, but I didn't know why it was. It was never clear to me. But with the Reform Judaism and the way we think, and what would be an appropriate age to have children understand many of these concepts?
I mean, I think that you slowly teach it over time from when they're little until they're old enough to do it themselves. But probably the deeper conversations really happen when they turn 13
Okay.
and they, for the first time, are taking part in a lot of these rituals.
Okay. So it's not until the bar mitzvah age in that sense. Okay.
Well, I mean, that's when I think the deeper questions often come up, because all of a sudden it's not something theoretical. It's
Yeah.
not something that mom and dad do.
Okay.
It's something that I am going to be doing. So maybe I should know something about it. But like, I know my kids, I've been having conversations with them about this since they were really little, because we fast, they see us doing it, they ask questions, you know, like that kind of a thing.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I would say on the harming yourself or kicking it too far, I don't believe that that's what my God does want someone to harm, because he wants us to be, if we fast, it's a personal thing, and it's supposed to be kept between us and him. And if I start to show signs of it, for one, then I'm not really being humble about what I'm doing. And I think also, just like when you're on an airplane, when the masks come down, it says, put your mask on first. Like, God always wants us to take care of ourselves so that we can be a good servant to him. And I think us going to the extremes on fasting or any of that stuff, I think doesn't make people want to follow God too, So I don't know, just my thought.
Yeah, exactly. But just like someone can be addicted to, drinking too much or something like that, someone could also be addicted to like asceticism, to self-denial. And it can go to an excess. We see it all the time. The number of people who are dealing right now with eating disorders and just with other forms of unhealthy self-denial is really astounding and incredibly problematic. And the idea that someone could take Jewish texts and practices and use that as a means to further hurt themselves is rather troubling. And so I personally really appreciate these flat out statements that no, don't go that too far. It's not helpful to do that. It doesn't actually do any good. It's really important to keep that in check so that we can be more in the middle ground.
Yeah, he uses the act of restraint. And I was thinking, I really like that until I finished reading the sentence. Because restraint doesn't mean that I'm going to make myself holier than thou, whatever that means. It's restraint to me is you're thinking about what you're doing. Should I do this? Should I not do this? The flip side of this is sometimes you will have, particularly women who are pregnant or are nursing their children, will say that restraint in that case does not mean that you fast at all. As a matter of fact, it says you should not with anything that is going to threaten your life. But I think restraint, if you're thinking about, and I do think about this, you know, am I going to not drink water today at all? Well, that for me would be very problematic. And it would be threatening my health. So maybe I did that when I was younger, but I'm not younger anymore. So it's an acceptance of what I am and what I am not. And it makes you, and I found this as I've gotten older, it really makes you think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and for how long you will be doing it, which in turn makes you think about, how am I going to do this or not do that? And am I going to be putting something else in its place? Maybe I only drink water, which you need to do anyway, but not anything else that I might drink, like my beloved cup of coffee, you know? And I think if you look at it that way, it makes you think about, how do I lead my life? Am I leading it in the most healthy way? Am I taking care of my body? Because if I don't take care of my body, I can't take care of myself or others. And it can encourage, I don't want to say force, but it certainly can encourage that kind of conversation and that kind of contemplation.
It sounds like what you're talking to is, one, self-knowledge, and two, self-discipline.
Yeah.
And that really does bring us into this text right here by Alan Marinas again, where he talks about, he says, though not condoning asceticism, the Musar teachers do speak of a kind of abstinence that is good and valuable. The ability to restrain ourselves is a necessary soul trait, and the very one that is often involved or invoked to guide a person who seeks to counter the tendency to overindulge. But this capacity to hold ourselves back is distinguished from asceticism. Abstinence can maintain or restore the middle way, whereas asceticism rejects it. You can go so far that you lose track of that, but discipline can be what holds you where, you know, you're in a healthy place. Another piece that I felt was important to bring in here is a very common text that we read during the High Holy Days itself. We read on Yom Kippur, right? Where it says, why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we starved our bodies, did you pay no heed? Because on your fast day, you see to your business and oppress all your labors. Because you fast in strife and contention, and you strike with a wicked fist. Your fasting day is not such as to make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast I desire, a day for men to starve their bodies? Is it bowing the head, or is it bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast? A day when the eternal is favorable? No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to ignore your own kin. And what is this text teaching us? What is its core?
The teaching us kavanah, that it's really about the intention of what we're doing that's so important in our spiritual development.
So the end isn't self-denial, right? The end is to get us to think about what actually we need to be doing, to pause our thinking, to pause our everyday life so that we can refocus ourselves. It also is very similar, I think, to how Muslims view the holiday of Ramadan, right? There is the same kind of self-denial during daylight hours of not eating during the day, but eating at nighttime. And one of the teachings around that is that it helps people to be able to gain empathy for people who don't always have food on the table, for people who don't have the same kind of access to things that perhaps we might take for granted. And here too, by fasting during this day, we recognize that there are people who are truly struggling, and perhaps it can invoke some sort of empathy and
Because they can eat.
drive in us to create a world that is more fair and equitable.
Eating it one day, every day.
Yeah, go ahead. Who was saying something? Sorry. I don't know. Okay. Sorry, I thought someone was trying to say something there. I'll bring in just one last text where it says, what is the problem with asceticism? One is that the ascetic, consciously or unconsciously, is rejecting the gifts that he or she has received in life, all of which ultimately derive from God. Judaism does not condone the extreme rejection of desire and pleasure because it views this physical material realm where we find ourselves as true, valuable, and spiritual, not an illusion to be transcended, as some other religious traditions suggest. The Musar teachers tell us that it is within this world, rather than in rejection of it, that we can elevate our spiritual natures. So to have some discipline for a day, totally fine, in the greater context of being able to enjoy the world in moderation.
And to this I say amen, because I am familiar with some people who think that they become more holy by withholding from themselves as suffering, which seems to be a complete rejection of what God has given us.
And there are many traditions in which that is the thought, right? And there even are some streams of Jewish thought in which that's the case, right? You look at the Nazarites, there is some self-denial that goes on there. But as a whole, Judaism tolerates that, doesn't condone that. That's not central to Jewish belief.
There was this famous French chef, Pierre Prudhomme, had a restaurant in New Orleans. Occasionally, he was asked, you occasionally get really picky people that come in about the menu. And he says, yeah, occasionally I'll get a couple that'll sit there and stare at the menu and say, well, make a choice. And they would say, well, we consider our bodies a temple and we don't want to defile our temple by putting something in it that shouldn't be there. Which Pierre Prudhomme said, well, you may think your body's a temple. I think mine is a playground. So that's one extreme to the other.
So let's go to the other. Let's talk through the other now, Herb.
Okay.
So
well, in that frame, every society, every cult, religious organization, they all have some means of deprivation at some period of time. The Native Americans had a sweat lodge. They get in there and stay for 2-3 days until they're completely delirious and have some spiritual awakening. Lent is 40 days. You choose, I guess you get an option what to give up. Things like that. I can't think of any society that does not believe in some form of deprivation somehow or another. And the more primitive the society, the more difficult or more challenging to accomplish.
I'm not sure about that last part, but I think that discipline is a really big part of a lot of faiths, right? Because it's through discipline that we can really kind of hold ourselves in check. And that discipline, if taken too far, can become asceticism. But discipline as a whole is actually a good thing as long as it's done in moderation.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So let's look at the other side of things, which is guarding against hedonism. And Rabbi Cassi says, if Yom Kippur, Mark's going to be so upset, I keep spelling his name wrong. I got to fix it. If Yom Kippur draws dangerously close to asceticism, Sukkot tempts us with hedonism. Therefore, it too needs strictures to keep our extremist tendencies in check. Our Torah commands us to be happy on Sukkot. You shall rejoice, uzmachtem, before the eternal your God 7 days. And we see so many ways in which that celebration, it comes right after Yom Kippur. It comes like 3 days after Yom Kippur. All of a sudden, we're rejoicing with this great big celebration filled with wonderful feasts of food, filled with wine, filled with a lot of celebration, which we really want to have. But it could be taken to extreme. Proverbs teaches that the righteous man eats to his heart's content, but the belly of the wicked is empty. And I wonder if you could kind of like, what exactly is this getting to? What does that mean? But the belly of the wicked is empty.
Can't satisfy anybody. Can't satisfy whatever your craving is.
Yeah. Well, I think this is related to the spirituality and the absence of the recognition of God in that person's life, who is a wicked, not doing unto others appropriately and taking from others, whatever the definition of wicked is. But I don't know if it necessarily relates to actually eating, but I have other thoughts about it, because it says the belly of a righteous man. Anyway.
It also
Yeah.
says content, that the righteous is content. There's a point at which you say, I have sufficient, I have enough.
Yeah.
And to be what is, if you're saying that you're eating and your body is empty, it's like this is a person where it's never enough. More. It's about me. And what do you think about me? And what can you do for me?
Right.
Instead of a point at which you say, I have what I need. And now I can move into, to me, what is implied, thinking about somebody besides myself, that I'm not empty of meaning in my life.
Yeah.
If you're just doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over, and that's all you're thinking about is you, there's a problem there for you and for everyone else around you.
Yeah, beautifully said, Rabbi Catherine. Other thoughts or comments? Yeah, please. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a thought. This is Reform Judaism, and we're talking about moderation, and it sounds really good to me. This is where I belong. But what about, as part of our religion, the very extreme orthodoxy, and that suppress women, and their role is in the home, taking care of their husbands, the kids, and the Rebbe makes all the decisions, and so forth. So I have a hard time reconciling that with what we're learning.
So, I mean,
that's extreme. Does that mean that's, I see it as not necessarily being healthy. I understand, on the other hand, decisions are made for people, so life therefore is easier in some senses, and it limits you what you could do, what you can't, so less temptations and so forth. But how does that apply to our Judaism and what God would really want us to do?
So, I mean, it's another really good, complicated question, right? I think sometimes we see ways of life that are distinct from our own as being extreme. But as we think that, we also need to recognize that people who have different cultural values and perspectives might see us as being extreme. And so how do we use that? Or how do we come to understand that, right? There are many people for whom the Orthodox way of life, the ultra-Orthodox way of life, I should say, Orthodoxy is incredibly broad, and modern Orthodoxy does not resemble Hasidism, does not resemble lots of different sects, right? It's extremely broad.
Yeah, I'm talking
right?
about extreme Orthodoxy.
But there are people who live within extreme Orthodox groups where for them it actually is a healthy and good lifestyle. right? Even if it's not for us, like there's a reason we choose not that. That's not ours, but that doesn't mean that theirs is wrong or that theirs is extreme. It just means that it's obviously not the right fit for us. When we talk about extreme, though, your question of there is extreme within Judaism, how do we understand that?
Yeah.
Is a really good one, right? We have the holiday of Purim, for example, right? Purim, one of the mitzvot, is that we are supposed to get so drunk that we cannot tell the difference between the good guy and the bad guy. That does not seem like moderation to me, right? And so what do we do with these specific examples within our tradition that do lead us to excess? And perhaps it's the exact parallel of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is this day that we fast. Purim is this day that we let go. And that can lead to some crazy things. But does that define what it means to be Jewish? Yeah. Did you want to say something, Frank?
Yeah, actually, I will. I didn't. Someone else was, I thought, talking, but just we do have to think, though. There are people, just because we get together once or twice a week to study Torah, think we're extreme. Like they're like, that's extreme. Like, so it really is the line of who's extreme from what. You really, I know for a fact that people would think that just believing in a God and not believing in science is extreme. And so we just have to look at that too, that sometimes we are even looked at that way for believing this. So you said it perfectly. I was thinking about the Hasidic and stuff. Like, there are people, this is a great country where you can choose to live any way you want, hopefully, and keep that way. But that's just a path that people have chosen, and that's just the way it is. And if that's what it feels brings them closer to Hashem, then that's what they do. Like, I don't know. I just know we have people can see extreme even in anything that we're even doing. So
yeah, that's true. But I mean, that underlying question of there being extreme, like there being extreme within Judaism, does absolutely make sense within the tradition. And I think that's what we're grappling with here and with the holiday of Sukkot, that you can take this wonderful obligation of partying and take that to extreme. In fact, there's even a Jewish value of like doing a holiday up, right? Of when you have Shabbat, using the finest decorations to set your Shabbat table and dressing in the nicest clothes and doing the nicest thing that you can do in order to celebrate the holiday with the most love. Could that be taken to extreme too?
Yeah.
Right? So even as we're being called and commanded, or these values are being uplifted, at the same time, we're being told, but not to excess. Do this, make it as great as possible, but not to excess. This constant kind of balancing act that's going on in every direction. So I'm going to bring us back to Maimonides. He's a good place to come back to, right? And says, when a person eats and drinks in celebration of a holiday, he is obligated to feed converts, orphans. I don't like the way that the wording is there with converts. This again, 12th century, I wouldn't use this wording quite this abruptly. Orphans, widows, and others who are destitute and poor. In contrast, a person who locks the gates of his courtyard and eats and drinks with his children and his wife without feeding the poor and the embittered is not indulging in rejoicing associated with a mitzvah, but rather the rejoicing of his gut. So what is he getting at here, right? Like we have in Proverbs, we have this part of a righteous man eats until he's content. He eats enough to satiate his hunger and he's happy, and then others can have everything else. But someone who is not righteous would just keep on eating and never feel satisfied, just want more and more and more. And then we have Maimonides' piece here where he's adding in this other element. What is he getting to?
I mean, he's getting towards that he's arrogant and not thinking of others. I mean, that's the whole point. And it goes to the part where it says the righteous man eats his heart content. Right. I love that part. Like our heart, the person's heart content is how much I can eat and be content and not overindulge. But I like the part too where you think about the belly of the wicked. Now I'm going to say this and it might sound like I'm being mean to my kids, but I'm not. But you ever have the times when your kids will come in the house and they're screaming that there's no food in the house and you need to go get something for them, but the house is full of food? Like, they're not wicked, but they're not thinking that, wow, my dad has this house full of food. Wow, I have food and other kids don't, right? They're just thinking of themselves when they're like, I want something else to eat. And so that pops up in all of us sometimes when we have enough. And to not give to somebody else, just to give again, America throws away, just an example, we throw away more food in one day than some countries in South America eat in a week. We throw away that much food. So that's gluttony, you know, that's something we have to look at. So, but that's what this reading reminded me of that.
Yeah.
I really love our, tradition and commandment to for tzedakah and giving to the poor and the needy. It's not a choice, but an obligation. And so I really look at this word, and in my own mind, I make it in bold, because whether I'm doing it directly or giving to charities that feed the poor and take care of them, I think that's important for us to do, and be grateful for all that we have in our lives. I really do.
Beautiful. And looking at this Maimonides text too, I want to underline one other thing that he's pointing out here, right? In addition to all of these great comments, that Maimonides is saying it's not a celebration if what you're doing is indulging in whatever you want. That's not what a celebration is. It's not a celebration unless everyone is included in it, unless we make sure that everyone can truly celebrate. If you have so much while you are near people who have so little, you are not celebrating. And that's really interesting, right?
I have one comment. There's something in San Pedro every year when they fed the poor. This organization, which Howard ran, I can't remember his last name, one of our temple members.
Euler, yeah.
Yeah, okay, we would help out sometimes, and they didn't just have a food line where people filled a tray and sat at the table. They went to the table and took an order, served them at the table, treated them as if they were in a restaurant, and sat down with them and enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It makes me tear up thinking about what those people might have received that day besides just the food.
Yeah, exactly. And I used to be a coordinator of a soup kitchen, and we would have at the seminary, we had a pianist, and we went around and served people and talked to them. And a lot of times, people who I got to know would tell me that this was the only time of the week that they felt like they were being treated as human beings. And that's heartbreaking, right? But it's so important to be able to have that interaction. Looking at the time, it's 1:59, and I'm so sad I can't bring in these two other texts because they're good ones, but I'm just gonna end with this last one by Alan Marinis, because I think it brings a lot of what we're talking about together. So he said, the Musar teachers tell us that the secret to becoming masters of moderation is to cultivate sensitivity to the inner process of desire as they arise within us. And this goes back to the self-knowledge that Rabbi Catherine was talking about earlier. They urge us to be aware of the inner course that makes an impulse runs, starting as a tiny sensation and eventually growing to full-blown indulgence. This is what prompts Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Sher to write that a person cannot undertake to follow the Musar way of life until he fully understands the process of thought formation and the modes of thought development. That this is our call to better get to know ourselves, to be able to take a moment and think, are there ways in which I'm too self-indulgent? Are there ways in which I am acting from a place of self-denial? And can I find a more moderate way, a place that might be healthier for me and those around me? So I want to thank you all so much, as always, for your thoughtful questions and insights and everything else. It's really such a pleasure to be able to study with all of you. And next week, we'll continue through the book of Leviticus. And I look forward to seeing you at 1 o'clock then too.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Rabbi.
Bye, everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.